So I wired General Beauregard and I told him he must hold at all costs. General Beauregard, with 3,000 men under his command, held off Baldy Smith's advance guard of 30,000.
Doc Henry's one. I know, I seen him a couple
Nearly
of
2 months.
Something.
Thank you.
General Grant's been unable to break my lines. I've been unable to break his lines. It's one of the worst winters in recent memory. Many of the men without shoes or overcoats. Some didn't even have tentage. Food was extremely scarce. Rats were a delicacy. In fact, as I would ride through the cavalry camps, you would see the soldiers sifting through the dung piles of the horses and mules looking for undigested corn. I don't tell this to shock you, but more to express how desperate our situation was becoming. On the 24th of March of 1865, I called the Council of War, General Longstreet, General Gordon, General Fitzhugh Lee, General A.P. Hill, and General Pendleton. And I told them, you must find a way to break through General Grant's defenses within the next 24 hours, or I feared we will be totally surrounded by General Grant's cavalry. General Gordon came back a few hours later, and he said he had found a weak point, and he wished to exploit it. I said, do it. Move out at 4 o'clock in the morning with 12,000 men under your command. By mid-morning, I could still hear firing going on, but I had no idea what was happening. So I dispatched Lieutenant Colonel Venerable to ascertain the situation, and he comes back and he tells me, General Gordon had tremendous success. He took 2 artillery batteries. He took Fort Stedman. But by dawn, he could see that the Federals were heavily reinforcing their infantry. And he needed General Longstreet to come up and support. General Longstreet sent word he could send no one as he was engaged at his end of the line. It was at that point I realized that Petersburg needed to be abandoned. And I wired His Excellency President Davis and told him, you must leave Richmond and you must leave it now, for the Army is leaving Petersburg. I had 26,000 rations put aboard a train for Amelia Station. And I would march the Army 2 nights and a full day to get there. When we got there, we flung open the car doors of the trains, and there was no food. Orders that obviously had gotten mixed up. The train was full of ammunition, and we had more ammunition than we could carry. I was left with one of 3 decisions to make. I could either turn the Army around, face the Federal onslaught. I'd already written in my itinerary. Told her I was prepared to die at my post. Or I could disband the Army and fight a guerrilla war. Or we could continue to try and limp along and get the boys down to Lynchburg and get them on the trains to get them to North Carolina to link up with General Johnston. Well, it wasn't about to turn the Army around because the spirit of the Army was still too good. And I was not going to disband the Army to fight a guerrilla war because no man would have been under any officer's command then. And the men were so hungry, they would have done anything to find food. And those that would suffer would be our own civilian population. And I could not have that on my conscience. So we would limp along, finding very little food. We're in northwestern Virginia, very sparsely populated. We pulled into Farmville on the evening of the 8th of April. And word came to me that the Federals were in front of us. I said, no sir, we're moving much too fast. There's no way they could be here this soon. But they were. Called another council of war that night. General Longstreet, General Pendleton, General Fitzhugh Lee, General Gordon. General A.P. Hill was killed on the 2nd during the evacuation. I told General Gordon, you're going to move out at 4 o'clock in the morning with 10,000 men under your command and push that cavalry aside. Again, by mid-morning, I could still hear firing going on, but I had no word as to what was happening. Once again, I sent Lieutenant Colonel Venerable to ascertain the situation. He came back and he said, General Gordon pushed that cavalry aside, but behind it there was nothing but bayonets. It was at this point I realized I must go meet this General Grant. And I would rather die 1,000 deaths than have to do that. Made that ride in to meet him. Appomattox. And to my surprise, his terms of surrender were extremely liberal. Now he was trying to lighten the mood, talking about when we were served in Mexico, but I was in no mood for that. But he allowed all the men to return home until and paroled them. Officers retained their sidearms and their horses.
Yes, yes.
And then he said, "Is there anything else you'd like to mention?" I said, "Well, the cavalry and the artillery in our army is different than that of the United States Army." He says, "How so?" I said, "Our men own their own horses and mules. I'd like to know if they can take them with them. They will need them for their spring plantings." He said he would not change the terms of the surrender, but he did say, any man mentions to the parole officer that he owns a horse or a mule, he'll be allowed to take him home. This was very gratifying to the men. That evening I was back in camp, and I received the dispatch through the lines from General Grant, and I thought, oh, the other boot's going to drop. But all he wanted was another meeting on the morning of April 10th. And what he wanted me to do, he wanted to know if I had any authority over the other officers in the field to surrender their armies. And I said, "No, sir. I am no longer in the army. I have no authority." And I would not speak to him for a couple of years afterwards. That morning, my staff and I mounted our horses and began our long ride back to Richmond. And my mind was flooded with all kinds of thoughts. How could I have allowed this to happen to the Army of Northern Virginia? There should have been another way. I was so angry with myself I could barely live within my own skin. Then my mind drifted to the officers that had served under me. General Jackson. No finer officer ever served in this army than him. All I had to do is look at him, and he knew exactly what I needed done. And then there was General Stewart, the man that I considered almost a fourth son. I had known him since my son was in West Point when I was commandant, and he would come to my house on Sunday afternoons for dinner and flirt with my daughters. I thought he was going to marry my daughter, Mary. When he died, I literally cried like a baby. And I don't believe my daughter Agnes will ever get over the loss of General Jackson or General Stewart. Then my mind drifted to the darkies. Where are they going to go now? Where will they live? How will they earn a living? Where were they going to lay their head at night? And as we arrived in Richmond, I'm greeted with thousands of people in the street cheering me. I said, "What are you doing? How could you be cheering me? I just surrendered the largest army of the Confederacy. We have lost the war." But they just continued on, and they followed me all the way to Franklin Street where my wife lived. And even after I disappeared inside the doorway, they stayed for hours and hours just cheering and cheering. It's the darndest thing I've ever seen. In the morning, when I woke up, I looked out the front windows, and here's all these people lurking out in front of the house, trying to get a look at me. There was reporters wanting an interview with me. Well, I made the mistake of giving an interview to one gentleman. And I said things that I probably should not have said because I just made things worse for the people of the South. So I decided I'm not going to give any more interviews. But every day, in the middle of the night, rap, rap, rap on the windows, rap, rap on the doors. People wanting to interview me. Finally relented with a British reporter, under the promise that he would never reveal anything we talked about. Well, as soon as he left, he boarded a ship for London, and he printed everything. I said, "No more. I'm not going to interview anybody anymore." But I needed to get out of Richmond. I needed a place to gather my thoughts, some peace, to realize, what am I going to do for the rest of my life? We are now penniless. We have no home anymore. And a friend of ours loaned us a home in Derwent, about 30 miles outside the city. And I loved it. It was really peaceful, very quiet. My wife hated it. She hated being out there, but it was what I needed. You know, I could have done engineering work, but that's a young man's job. And I'm not in the best of health. And one day, a gentleman arrives at the front porch in a borrowed suit. Said he was from Washington College in Lexington. He wanted to know if I would accept a position as president of the college. So they figured with my name attached to the college, it would draw people back to the school. And I initially said no. I've run West Point before. I don't want to run another college. But then the more I thought about it, I thought, what better way could I give back to the men that served in my army? To help them get an education, get on with their lives. So I accepted the position, and I arrived there in October of 1865. They had about 3 or 4 teachers and about 30 students. A year later, we had 40 teachers and over 400 students. Things were going very, very well. Then the reporters showed up again. The reporter said, General Lee, we want an interview with you. I said, no, sir, I do not give interviews. But General Lee, we just want to ask one question. Do you have any regrets? I said, no, sir, I have no regrets. I would do everything exactly the same as I did it before. Oh, come on, General Lee, you must have at least one regret. What about your daughter Mary? I said, what? Or your daughter Annie? I said, what about Annie? Well, she died and you didn't even go to her funeral. I said, sir, what would you have done for her? The Army was in the field. My responsibility for the thousands of men that served under me. I could not attend that funeral. But the thought of never seeing her face or hearing her voice ever again in my life was no more than I could bear. I said, General Grant, or General Lee, you must have at least one regret. I said, well, now that you make me think about it, I do. I regret ever having a military education from West Point Military Academy. He said, what do you mean? You're a great general. You're probably one of the best there is. I said, yeah, I guess I am pretty good. But I'm directly responsible for over 100,000 young men laying dead in their graves tonight. And I'm directly responsible for nearly 250,000 young men trying to get by from day to day without arms, without legs, without eyes. I said, that all rests with me. Sir, this interview is over. Be gone. I would continue at Washington College until October 12th of 1870, when I passed away as a result of a stroke. They kept giving me water, kept me laying in bed, and the water eventually got into my lungs. And when water gets into your lungs, you develop pneumonia. And the doctors back then had seen enough cases of pneumonia that you could pick the hour you were going to die. That's why I went for that. Thank you.
Thank you.